the medieval world. Now, I'm going to talk about the cathedrals because this was a big part of Europe, and also your book mentions it. There came about two types of architecture, Romanesque and Gothic, and I've just summed up. The Romanesque had the barrel roofs. You know, the Romanesque were patterned after the old Romans, except the Romans used flat roofs or made of wood. Well, these did not look so sightly, so they used barrel roofs, which your book shows a picture of on page 352. But these type of roofs were made of stone and had to have really, really heavy walls to support the stone. Therefore, they were dark inside. In contrast, the Gothic cathedrals came along. Now, I have read that the word Gothic has nothing to do with the Goths. Why they're called Gothic, nobody seems to know, but they were not invented by the Goths. But they used ribs for the roofs, in other words, and then between the ribs they could put stained glass. Therefore, they were very light inside, but the light, because it was stained glass and that they used natural light. Now, this was before the invention of the electric light bulb. So they used natural light, but the light was often multicolored. So if you go into one of those, in those days, the light from the sun would be shining through some stained glass roofs, or yeah, stained glass windows, stained glass roofs also. And it would be a multicolored light you'd see, and it would give you the impression of going into another world. Your book also says that the buildings, the structures seemed to defy gravity, and that everything was pointing skyward. They had towers, and the church tower has become a symbol of church today. And oftentimes in the old churches, there was inside the tower was a bell. It would ring when it was time to call to worship, ring throughout the whole community. But they gave the impression of heaven, being heavenward or pointing heavenward, and seemed to defy gravity. Now, I want to say this about the glasses, the stained glass. You may have heard that glass is actually classified not as a solid but as a liquid because the glass is very, very slowly flowing. But it's flowing so slowly it takes hundreds of years for it to flow. But some of these old stained glass are starting to flow downward and actually crack open at the top because they're flowing downward. And some of them are thinking about or have already started to replace because the liquid glass has over the centuries flowed to have been pulled down by gravity to where the glass is too thick at the bottom and too thin at the top, breaking open the top. So glass is, again, now classed as a liquid. Even though it flows so slowly, you can hardly see it, or you can't see it except over a period of several generations. All right. This takes us up to the Crusades. Well, first of all, the book starts about medieval Europe expanding because Europeans are known for their having burst out from their borders and expanded all over the globe. The Vikings, your book does mention, I forgot they mentioned it here, but they do mention the Vikings did in fact establish a colony in North America, and it's the only one known, the only colony known. It did not last long. Your book doesn't say why, but I've heard one of the reasons was the Vikings were not prepared to fight the Indians, which in the year 1000, the Indians numbered quite a bit more than they were a number of 500 years later when the Spanish came over. Disease wiped them out, and they may have gotten their diseases from European fishermen who are now known to have crossed the ocean from time to time. They'd cross the ocean, and actually sometimes it's believed they actually traded with the Indians, but they fished off North American shores. And some of them might have spread their diseases to the Indians, but also it's known that American Indian women simply did not seem to want to have children. The Sioux were the exception. The Sioux women would have some 6 to 8 babies per woman, and that's why the Sioux tribe burst out from Minnesota and spread west and overpowered a lot of the weaker tribes. But the American Indian women simply did not seem to want to have children. Also, one of your books that this school uses says the average age for the American Indians in North America, we can tell this by their skeletons, the average age of death was only 18. life then was extremely short. Hardly any of them lived to be 40. And yet they had a few. They had a few who obviously lived to be 80 or 90. We can tell this by their skeletons. But they were very, very few. But for most Indians, life was short, and their population kept declining. And by the time that the later Europeans arrived in the early 1500s, their population was greatly reduced. But the Vikings, even though the Vikings had iron, had hatchets, had shields, and had armor, they were greatly outnumbered by the Indians they encountered. And after 10 years, they left Nova Scotia. And they never left Greenland. But eventually, the Black Death came and stopped European expansion, which we'll talk about in a little bit. All right, Crusades. I really only want to remember 5 Crusades. That's all your book elaborates on. And the 5th one, that last one there, I'm going to talk about, even though your book does not. I don't think your book even mentions it. But there was a children's crusade. Anyway, the first crusade is sometimes called the People's Crusade. It was led by nobility. Count Raymond of Toulouse, Duke Godfrey, Count Raymond, some of these high nobility led it. It is the only crusade that can be called a military success. They caught the Muslim world divided and unprepared, and these Europeans just came in and swooped in, and they took a whole bunch of kingdoms right here. Now, ironically, the Byzantine emperor had asked the Pope to send help because he said, I cannot fight these Turks who are coming in. The Byzantine had sent for help, and ironically, the Crusades were to wind up destroying the Byzantine Empire. Anyway, when the Crusaders arrived, there was trouble right away. The emperor said, I want any land you conquer to be conquered in my name. And the Crusaders said, no, any land we conquer, we're going to conquer in our name. So this led to trouble right from the start. Anyway, the Crusaders set up 4 kingdoms right along here. The kingdom of Jerusalem and the kingdom of Edessa and a couple of others. And these kingdoms were patterned very much like the feudal system that they come from. Then the Crusaders went home. When their neighbors gave them trouble, Europe sent a second crusade led by kings. One of them was Louis VII, who married Eleanor of Aquitaine. It failed. This crusade carried some 50 women along, and these women did not stay within bounds, to say the least, including Eleanor herself. Anyway, Louis went back home in defeat. The third crusade, they thought this one really, we have 3 kings. Initially had 3 kings, King Frederick I, Richard the Lion-Hearted, and Philip Augustus. Frederick drowned while swimming, and his army just simply disbanded. Philip Augustus decided, I've had enough of this, I'm needed in France, and he returned home and gave up. If those 2 kings had remained with their armies, perhaps they could have defeated Saladin, and our history today might be a lot different, folk. As it was, Richard was opposed by Saladin, one of the most able leaders Islam ever produced. You may know Saladin made news in modern times because Saddam Hussein was a big fan of Saladin, just like he was a fan of Nebuchadnezzar. Anyway, Saladin recaptured Jerusalem and essentially drove the Crusaders out of the Holy Land entirely. But Richard was able to get an agreement with him that Saladin would allow Christian pilgrims to travel to Jerusalem, as they had done for centuries. Then Richard himself even went home. Richard was captured and put in prison for a while. And some say he died while in prison. Others say he actually made it back to England. Be that as it may, then this takes us up to the 4th crusade. Now, folk, something I have not mentioned until now, but I'm going to mention it now. Your book does mention it. From the very beginning, the Crusaders were anti-Jew. And this was the beginning of a systematic persecution of Jews that was to actually last until 1945, on again, off again. There was a strong wave of anti-Semitism. These Crusaders would come up to a Jewish community and set fire to the community, and while the Jews inside were screaming, the Crusaders would be waving their hands and praising God hilariously for their victory over what they perceived to be Christ's enemies. Folks, I'm telling you this in raw format. Not that I approve of any of it, believe me, I don't. But nevertheless, I think it warrants mention because anti-Semitism is still alive and well in the world today. And in the days of your grandparents, about that time, or in the days of my father, your grandparents, anti-Semitism reared its ugly head in a very, very big way across the world. But they destroyed a whole lot of Jews, Jewish communities they came across. And ironically, what the Jews wound up doing, the Jews felt compelled to leave Portugal, to leave Spain, to leave France, and eventually in 1290, the King of England at the time expelled them from England. They were driven out of Italy and Germany. They congregated right here, not in Germany, they were driven out of England and Italy, but they congregated right here in Germany and Poland. This region of Europe here is likely being concentrated in this region here, which set them up for the Holocaust that came in the 1940s. So many of them were concentrated right here, and it's like, once Hitler, they're like, I've got them all. They're cornered here, no place to go, and he systematically destroyed a lot of them. But their movement into this region of Europe began during the Crusades. Again, you can't say the history of what these people did wound up influencing people generations later. Now, the Fourth Crusade, ironically, the Crusaders lost their zeal for fighting the Muslims, and instead they turned on Constantinople, and they took Constantinople. And for about 50 years, Western Europeans ruled Constantinople, and the people of Constantinople fled into the surrounding area. After about 50 years, the Byzantine Empire was able to rally enough troops to drive the Crusaders out, but the Crusaders had done irreparable damage to the Byzantine Empire, and the Byzantines were never able to fully recover from the damage of the Fourth Crusade. And in the year 1453, the Byzantine Empire came to an end. It took about a couple hundred years, but thanks to the efforts of the Fourth Crusade, the Byzantine Empire was weakened. And in the next chapter, we're going to spend several minutes talking about the Byzantine Empire. I've mentioned it from time to time because it was an important part of Europe's history. Now, we come to another crusade, folk, that is not in a book, but I find it really intriguing, and I must mention it. The Children's Crusade. Right here in this part of Europe, a bunch of European youngsters got the idea that they could do what the older generation could not do, and young boys and girls. Half of the crusade went on the crusade were girls. About 25,000 in two waves, 50,000 or so altogether, marched toward the Holy Land, believing they could take it. The Children's Crusade never reached Constantinople. Now, folk, don't ask me, because I have no answer. Where were these kids' parents? 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, 13, and 14 years old, 15. Hardly any of them older than 16 or 17. No adults. Where were their parents? What kind of mindset? I have to use those other words I could use, but I would say what kind of mindset would allow parents to allow their children to go off with thousands of other kids, male and female alike, on a venture that was certain to fail. Every one of the Children's Crusaders either died along the way or were sold into slavery by the Muslims. None of them even reached Constantinople. Again, as strange as it may seem, I feel like I must tell it because somehow or another you get people who behave in a way that is just simply utterly insane. Now, this may sound more like mythology, but one person said that the Crusaders were influenced. That the story of the Children's Crusade led to the story of the Pied Piper. The Pied Piper would play such beautiful music, lure children into a cave, and once in the cave, the children never seen again. And he made a comparison that the children who went on the crusade left home, none of them ever returned. One of the saddest wars, you might say, in all of history. After the Fourth Crusade, there were other crusades. All told, there's been about 200 crusades that we've dug up, dug memory of. Most of them were little bitty events. Now, in addition now to trying to take the Holy Land back, there was another crusade going on constantly here in Western Europe to try to drive the Moors out of Spain, which they eventually did. But this one was last centuries also, and some of the crusaders, instead of going this way, some went here. But there were 9 major crusades over a period of 200 years. The last crusade ended in the year 1290 in defeat. Then your book says that Europe realized they couldn't reconquer the Islamic worlds. But part of it, folk, was in 1307, the Black Death hit Europe, and Europe was just in no shape to mount an organized effort to go outside their own land. So the crusading spirit, though officially ended in 1290, had the Black Death not occurred, but again, you can never tell from history what might have been. Or what might have been. So there might have been another crusade later, as it was. Now, I'm going to jump ahead of the story a little bit.